Section 6. Wherein the conduct of the judicatories is considered, since the time that the secession from them was first stated and declared, and particularly the conduct of ministers and judicatories with respect unto the late Act of Parliament, anent Captain John Porteous, as also the Act of Assembly 1738 against the seceding ministers, are inquired into. I have, in the preceding sections, laid the argument for secession from the present judicatories mainly in the shape in which the secession was stated when 4 ministers were thrust out from communion with them, anon 1733, in consequence of an act and sentence of the preceding assembly passed against the said ministers. But though a secession was stated at the time upon very just and weighty grounds, yet it is to be regretted that the judicatories of this national church, so far from showing a disposition for removing the grounds of secession, that by their procedure from time to time they increase or strengthen the same, and instead of affording to the seceding brethren the agreeable hopes of union and conjunction with them in the Lord, the procedure of the judicatories is such as gives them more and more reason and ground, not only for the continuing in their secession, but even for enlarging and extending the same further than it was stated before the commission of the General Assembly in the foresaid year, 1733. There are some things advanced by the author of the essay, page 5, wherewith he thinks to twit the seceding brethren, as for instance, that our reverend brother Mr. Erskine, in his answers to the remarks of the Synod of Perth and Stirling on his sermon, October 12, 1732, says, quote, I know that there is a great body of faithful ministers in the Church of Scotland, with whom I do not reckon myself worthy to be compared, unquote. And downward in the same answers, quote, I know that a vast many of them have God's call, and the Church's call, unquote. Hence our author concludes, quote, if there be a body, and a great body, many and a vast many in the Church of Scotland, of faithful ministers, having God's call to the work of the gospel, I think she is a true Church of Christ, and who, says he, can but own her for such, unquote. I shall not insist upon the terms true church, so frequent with our author. I have said that I judge sufficient upon them. I have said what I judge sufficient upon them, But I must here observe that our author's above conclusion, in which he seems to boast, does not at all follow from any of his premises. And my reason for this observation is, that though there should be many, yea, a vast many ministers in a church, having the Lord's call to the work of the gospel, yet if the majority in the judicatories are carrying on a course of defection, the majority are still the court, and therefore the majority are the church representative. I have already proven that this national church, as she is represented in her present judicatories, is carrying on a course of defection from her Reformation principles, and I am about to confirm and illustrate the argument in this section. What then, though there should be many that have the Lord's call and the Church's call to the work of the ministry, who yet continue in connection and conjunction with the present judicatories? It does not therefore follow that this national church, as she is represented in them, is a true church according to the obvious sense and meaning, as above explained, of our 18th article of our first confession of faith. Therefore our author's argument may very well be turned against himself in the following manner. If it is so, as I have already proven, that the judicatories of this church are carrying on a course of defection from our Reformation purity and refuse to be reclaimed, then it is the duty of such ministers who profess to be grieved with their proceedings to come out from among them, and to bear testimony against a course of defection in a way of secession from them, that they may exert themselves in their station, and according to their power and ability, for asserting, maintaining, and defending the doctrine, worship, government, and discipline of the house of God, in this day of treading down in our valley of vision. For as there are degrees of faithfulness, so these worthy ministers would be more faithful to the head of the church, and to the commission they have received from him, as also to the souls of the present and rising generations, if they would depart from communion with the present judicatories, who pour contempt upon their representations and petitions, and where they are often bored down with banter and scorn when they make anything like an honest appearance against the faithful steps that are taken. And if they would associate together for the faithful discharge of their duty, and the exercise of the keys of government and discipline, for the ends and purposes for which they are given them by the exalted head of the church, If one heart and one soul were given to such ministers, who profess to be grieved with the present course of backsliding from the Lord, to exert themselves after this manner, it would be a promising token for good in these days wherein we have seen evil. It would be a door of hope unto this sinning, broken, and sinking church, and might, through the blessing of the Lord, stagger the counsels and projects of such as are carrying on a course of defection. There is another thing advanced by the author of the essay, pages 5 and 6, that is, that Mr. Erskine, in his protestation against the sentence of the Assembly, anon 1733, to which the other three ministers adhered, declares, quote, that he had a very great and dutiful regard to the judicatories of this church, to whom, says he, I owe my subjection in the Lord, unquote. He adds that the brethren in their representation given in the Commission of the Assembly, 1733, quote, when speaking of their protestation taken against the Commission that year, unquote, he should have said against the Assembly that year, quote, they say, our protestation is so far from impugning the just power and authority of the supreme judicatories of this church that it plainly acknowledges the same, unquote. From the above expressions our author argues, quote, now, if a true church, whose authority in her supreme judicatories in 1733 was to be acknowledged and regarded with a very great regard as just, I hope she is not vastly worse since that time. For some stop has been put to what then was the chief ground of complaint, that is, violent intrusions, unquote. I have already observed that it is not matter of fact that violent intrusions were the chief ground of complaint. There are two other things advanced by our author in his two last lines above cited. The one is when he tells us that he hopes this church is not vastly worse since the foresaid time, and the other is the ground he gives us for this hope, wherein, after his ordinary way, he extenuates our public sins by insinuating in his smooth manner that this church is somewhat amended. Quote, for, says he, some stop has been put to violent intrusions, unquote. But as this is the ground of our author's hope, I humbly judge it will be found as weak as his superstructure is imaginary. I humbly judge that it will be found as weak as his superstructure is imaginary. I might here observe that the above protestation mentioned by our author was entered while we were contending in a way of church communion with the judicatories, before the secession was declared and stated, and consequently while we were using the ordinary means of dealing with them for their repentance and reformation. Of this I have given some short account already in the introduction, and therefore shall not now insist upon it. What I here intend is to show that the present judicatories of this national church are worse, or to use our author's own words, they are vastly worse, since the above protestation was entered against the act and sentence of the Assembly, 1733. And for the proof of this, I offer the following particular instances of their procedure and conduct. First, after the entering of the above protestation, the foresaid Assembly passed an act and sentence against the protesting ministers, appointing their commission to suspend them in case they should not retract their protestation, and to lay them under an higher censure if they should not submit to the sentence of suspension. This was a step vastly worse than any step of the judicatories had yet taken, when it is considered that by the said act and sentence, new and unwarrantable terms of ministerial communion were imposed, as I have already observed. Our author could not but very well know that this sentence was posterior to the protestation, and as he never professes to justify, but rather seems to condemn the above sentence, so he cannot refuse that the judicatories may be at least somewhat worse. And if he had understood the present question and argument, he might have known that the point upon which the secession was at first stated was the above-mentioned act and deed of the Assembly, whereby ministers were deprived of their freedom and liberty of testifying doctrinally from the pulpit, and by protestation in the supreme judicatory against a course of defection. If notwithstanding of this sentence of the Assembly, posterior to the entering of the protestation, our author does not reckon the judicatories vastly worse, yet I doubt if he shall find a parallel unto this extraordinary sentence, since our reformation from popery, whereby 4 ministers were thrust out from communion with the judicatories on account of a protestation of their just and necessary exoneration. Secondly, the above arbitrary sentence was executed in a very arbitrary manner by the commission of the foresaid Assembly. They refused to consider what the protesting ministers had to offer for their just and necessary vindication. They refused the representation of above-mentioned reading. And the said ministers behooved to retract their protestation, otherwise nothing could satisfy the commission or save them from censure. As the arbitrary execution of the above extraordinary sentence was a step vastly worse than anything the judicatories had formerly done, so the proceedings of that commission were neither disapproven nor condemned by the subsequent assembly, but held in repute to be formal and legal deeds, as I have already shown from the act of the said assembly with reference to the seceding ministers. Thirdly, though the author alleges, page 6, that some stop hath been put to what he calls the chief ground of complaint, that is, violent intrusion, and, essay page 30, he tells us that a considerable stop has been put to them for some time bygone. Yet the present judicatories are worse even in the affair of violent intrusions than formerly. Every one of our assemblies since the year 1734 have either authorized, supported, or countenanced such violent settlements either upon the footing of the repealed Act 1732 or upon the footing of the Patronage Act, as for instance the Assembly 1735 appointed a call to be moderated for the presentee to the parish of Cerridon, and they refer the case of the enrollment of the intruders into the parish of Muckhart and Troquire unto the respective synods. As this was a plain authorizing of the synods to enroll these intruders, so the remit to the synod of Perth bears an appointment unto them to continue their endeavors to obtain harmony in that corner. The obvious meaning of this appointment is that they should use their endeavors to bring the people of Muckhart to submit to the ministry of an intruder. The Assembly 1736 appointed the Presbytery of Stirling to proceed to a violent settlement in the parish of Denny, and at the same time expressly enjoined the said Presbytery to be at pains to bring the people of the said parish to submit to the decisions of the Church, and to the ministry of the intruded presentee. The same Assembly appoint the Presbytery of Dumfries and synod to enroll the intruder into the parish of Troquire as a member of their respective judicatories, and to support him in his ministry, and to endeavor to bring the people of that parish to submit to it. Again, the Assembly anon 1737, quote, declare their dissatisfaction with the conduct of the Presbytery of Stirling in neglecting or refusing to obey the appointment of the Assembly 1736 with respect to the settlement of Mr. James Stirling, the presentee to the parish of Denny, and they appoint the said presbytery to proceed to the trials and settlement of the presentee to the said parish, and to finish the same before the 1st of the September that year. And in case he is not actually settled before that time, the synod of Perth and Stirling are appointed at their October meeting to proceed in his trials and to finish his settlement before the month of March ensuing. And it is expressly declared that it shall not be lawful for the synod to put any question whether they shall obey his appointment, but that any 10 or more ministers thereof do proceed as above directed, whether any others of the synod concur with them or not, or notwithstanding that others, or even the greatest part then present, should oppose the execution of this act, and in case the synod, or such number of them as above mentioned, shall not before the 1st of November enter the presentee upon trials, or before the 1st of March finish the same, the Assembly empower a special commission of the said General Assembly to convene at Edinburgh on the 3rd Wednesday of November or March, respectively, with power to adjourn themselves as they shall think fit, in order to take trials and ordain the presentee as minister of Denny." Unquote. Also, the same Assembly appoint a settlement in the town and parish of Perth upon the footing of the Act 1732, even when the majority of the elders of the said parish were dissenting from the said settlement, and a constitute session reclaiming against the same before all the judicatories of the Church. Likewise, the Assembly 1738 appointed a violent settlement in the parish of Drawn, the call being only signed by the heritors and one elder of the said parish, and the most part of the congregation by far dissenting and reclaiming, as also they sustained a call for Dr. Wishart, to be one of the ministers of Edinburgh, which proceeded purely upon the footing of the repealed Act 1732.